The sun was a merciless eye, glaring from a brassy sky that offered no solace, no hint of cloud or reprieve. Ilara lay sprawled on the baked earth, the grit coarse against her cheek, each grain a tiny torment. Her tongue was a leaden thing in her mouth, thick and useless, and the taste of dust, metallic and acrid, was her only constant companion. Around her, the desert stretched in an endless, undulating panorama of scorched rock and skeletal creosote, a landscape sculpted by wind and indifference. The silence was profound, broken only by the ragged whisper of her own breathing and the faint, high-pitched thrumming of heat against the eardrums. It was a silence that pressed in, amplifying the desolation that had taken root in her soul. Just hours ago, or was it a lifetime? There had been the rumble of wheels, the creak of leather, the low murmur of her fellow passengers. Then, the shouts, the terrifying explosion of gunfire, the splintering wood. She squeezed her eyes shut, but the images assaulted her still, the leering faces beneath dusty bandanas, the glint of steel, the raw, primal fear that had clawed at her throat. They had taken everything, the strong barks, the trinkets, the pathetic tokens of lives disrupted. And then, the casual cruelty, the shots that had silenced the driver, the guard, old Mrs. Albright with her gentle smile. Why they had left her, Ilara, she did not know. Perhaps they thought the desert would finish the job, a slower, more agonizing end. A shudder, cold despite the furnace heat, ran through her. She was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. The stagecoach, a broken husk, lay canted on its side some distance back, already looking like a forgotten relic. There was no water, no food, no shade beyond the meager shadow cast by a twisted juniper that offered little comfort. Hope was a cruel mirage, shimmering just out of reach, dissolving into the stark reality of her predicament. Despair, heavy and suffocating, settled over her like a shroud. Each breath was an effort, each heartbeat a painful reminder of the life ebbing away. This, then, was to be her grave, this vast, uncaring wilderness. The thought brought not tears, she was too dehydrated for that, but a hollow ache that resonated deep within her bones. The sun climbed higher, its heat intensifying, pressing down on her, baking the moisture from her skin, from her very will. A shadow fell across her face, sudden and cool. Ilara flinched, a gasp catching in her parched throat. Her eyes, gritty and burning, struggled to focus against the glare. A figure stood over her, tall and lean, etched against the blinding sky. Apache! The word screamed in her mind, a lifetime of fearful tales and whispered warnings coalescing into a single, potent dread. He was still, his presence immense, a part of the harsh landscape itself rather than an intrusion upon it. His dark eyes, unreadable as polished obsidian, scanned her, missing nothing. He wore buckskin, the color of the earth, and his black hair was bound back from a face that seemed carved from the very rock around them. Fear, sharp and icy, pierced through the lethargy of her despair. Was he one of them? Had the bandits sent him back? Or was this a new, more terrifying threat? Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. She tried to push herself up, to scramble away, but her limbs were leaden, unresponsive. A broken whimper escaped her lips. The warrior made no move, no sound. His gaze remained steady, unwavering, an assessment that stripped her bare, revealing her utter helplessness. Then, slowly, deliberately, he knelt. He reached for a water skin at his hip, the movement fluid, economical. The sound of the stopper being pulled, the faint gurgle of liquid within, was the most beautiful sound Ilara had ever heard. He extended the skin towards her. Water. The offering was simple, direct, yet in its starkness, it held the weight of life itself. Her mind reeled. Every instinct, honed by stories of savage raids and brutal conflict, screamed at her to refuse, to recoil. But the desert had stripped away such luxuries, leaving only the raw, primal urge to survive. Her cracked lips parted. Her gaze, filled with a desperate, agonizing conflict, met his. His expression remained unchanged, impassive, yet there was no overt menace in his eyes, only a profound stillness. This man, this Apache warrior, was offering her life. The choice, stark and terrifying, was hers. To die of thirst and fear, or to accept this unexpected, incomprehensible mercy from one she had been taught to dread. The sun beat down, and in that crucible of heat and desperation, the ingrained fear warbled, faltered, under the crushing weight of her need. Ilara's hand, trembling violently, reached for the water skin. Her fingers, clumsy and weak, brushed against his. His skin was warm, dry, like the earth itself. She brought the skin to her lips, the scent of wet leather and clean water overwhelmingly potent. The first sip was agony and ecstasy, a shock to her parched system. She drank slowly, carefully, as if relearning a forgotten art, the cool liquid a balm to her scorched throat, a promise whispered to her fading cells. When she finally lowered the skin, gasping, a measure of clarity had returned. The warrior had not moved, his gaze still upon her, though it seemed less an assessment now and more a quiet observation. He took the water skin back without a word and secured it. He then rose, his movements imbued with a natural grace that spoke of a life lived in harmony with this unforging land. He gestured vaguely towards the distant, hazy mountains, then looked back at her. The meaning was clear enough. If she wanted to live, she would have to follow. There was no pleading in his gesture, no threat, merely a statement of fact. The desert would not wait. Ilara looked back at the broken stagecoach, a monument to her shattered past. There was nothing for her there but ghosts and despair. Ahead, with this silent, enigmatic figure, lay uncertainty, perhaps even danger, but also the possibility of water, of shade, of survival. The fear had not entirely vanished, but it was now accompanied by a sliver of something else, a desperate, tenacious will to live that the water had rekindled. She pushed herself up, her muscles screaming in protest, her head swimming. The ground swayed beneath her. The warrior watched her struggle, his face unreadable. He did not offer a hand, but neither did he press her. He simply waited, a figure of patient strength. Gathering every ounce of her remaining resolve, Ilara took a stumbling step, then another. The sun beat down, but the water in her belly was a small, cool comfort. The journey began in silence, a slow, arduous trek across an alien world. He moved with an easy, tireless gait, navigating the treacherous terrain as if it were an extension of himself. She struggled to keep pace, her city-bred body ill-suited to the demands of the desert. Each step was an effort, her breath coming in harsh rasps. Yet, she persisted, driven by the primal instinct he had reawakened. He set a pace that, while challenging, was not impossible for her in her weakened state. Hours passed. The sun arced across the sky, a relentless tormentor. He led her to a meager patch of shade beneath an overhanging rock, where they rested briefly. He offered her more water, and produced a few dried berries from a pouch, their taste tart and unfamiliar, yet undeniably sustaining. Ilara observed him covertly, her initial terror slowly giving way to a grudging respect and a profound curiosity. He seemed to speak the language of the desert, reading its subtle signs, its hidden promises. He moved with a quiet confidence that was both intimidating and, strangely, reassuring. He was a mystery, a paradox, the product of the savage land she feared, yet her only hope within it. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the western sky, painting the stark landscape in hues of ephemeral beauty, Kale, for she had decided to give him a name in her thoughts, a humanizing anchor in the sea of her uncertainty, led her to a shallow draw, sheltered by a cluster of resilient, gnarled mesquite. The air grew cooler, a welcome respite from the day's relentless assault. He moved with purpose, gathering fallen branches, his actions economical and precise. Soon, a small fire crackled to life, a beacon of warmth and light in the encroaching darkness. The flames danced, casting flickering shadows that played across his stoic features, softening their harsh angles, lending them a momentary vulnerability that was perhaps only a trick of the light. Ilara huddled near the warmth, her exhaustion a heavy cloak. She watched him prepare a meager meal, a few roasted roots he had dug up earlier with a pointed stick, and more of the dried berries. He offered her a share, his gesture simple, devoid of any expectation. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackle of the fire and the distant, mournful cry of a coyote. The silence between them was no longer solely one of fear on her part, or so she dared to hope. It felt different now, a shared space, dictated by the vastness of the land and the paucity of words that could truly bridge the chasm between their worlds. She found herself studying his hands as he tended the fire, strong, capable hands that knew how to coax life and sustenance from the unyielding earth. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation. He was a creature of absolute competence in this domain she found so terrifying. She thought of the drawing rooms of her past, the polite conversation, the gilded cages. They seemed a world away, fragile and irrelevant. Here, survival was the only currency, and this man, this Apache, was its master. A profound sense of dislocation washed over her. Who was she, stripped of her societal trappings, her familiar comforts? A frightened woman, yes, but perhaps something more. A survivor. The thought was a fragile seedling, but it took root in the parched soil of her spirit. As the night deepened, he lay down a short distance from the fire, wrapping himself in a single blanket, his back to her. It was a gesture of trust, or perhaps indifference. Ilara wasn't sure which. She pulled her own thin shawl tighter, her gaze lingering on his still form before turning to the myriad stars that blazed in the ink-black sky, more brilliant and numerous than she had ever imagined. They were cold, distant, yet possessed of a terrible beauty, much like the land itself, and perhaps, like the man who had saved her. The following day, the sun rose with the same unforgiving intensity, but something within Ilara had shifted. The raw terror had receded, replaced by a weary determination. The memory of the attack still haunted the edges of her mind, a raw, festering wound. As they walked, a hawk circled high overhead, its shadow briefly passing over them. The sight, so ordinary, so natural, inexplicably triggered a fresh wave of horror. Suddenly, she was back at the stagecoach, the bandit's cruel laughter echoing in her ears, the glint of a pistol barrel, the scent of gunpowder and blood. Her breath hitched, her vision blurred. She stumbled, a choked sob escaping her. The world tilted, the heat and the memories merging into an unbearable vortex of anguish. She sank to her knees, her body trembling uncontrollably, the carefully constructed facade of her composure shattering. Cale, who had been a few paces ahead, stopped. He turned, his dark eyes taking in her distress. He did not approach immediately, did not speak. He simply stood there, a silent, watchful presence, allowing her the space for her grief, for her terror to spill forth. There was no judgment in his stillness, no impatience. He let her weep, the harsh, dry sobs racking her depleted frame until she was empty, hollowed out. When the storm of her emotions finally subsided, leaving her limp and spent, he moved. He came closer and placed the water skin gently beside her. Then, from his pouch, he produced a small, intricately woven piece of fabric, no bigger than her palm, patterned with faded dyes of berry and root. He held it out. Ilara looked at it, then at him, her vision still clouded with tears. It was a simple thing, perhaps a token, or something made for a child. Its significance was lost on her, but the gesture itself, so unexpected, so quiet, resonated. He then turned and walked a short distance to a patch of hardy desert blooms, tough little survivors clinging to life amidst the rock. He picked one, a bloom of surprising violet, and brought it back, laying it beside the woven fabric. He said nothing. He did not need to. The small, beautiful flower, a speck of vibrant life in the desolate expanse, spoke more eloquently than any words of comfort could have. It was an acknowledgement of her pain, perhaps, but also a reminder of resilience, of beauty persisting even in the harshest of places. He then moved away again, resuming his watch, giving her time. Ilara slowly reached for the flower, its petals delicate against her rough fingers. A profound sense of his quiet understanding settled over her, a balm to her wounded spirit. He was not a savage. He was a man who understood sorrow, who knew the language of the silent, suffering earth. And in that moment, a fragile thread of trust, more resilient than she could have imagined, began to weave itself between them. Their third day in the wilderness brought a new, more immediate menace. The sky, which had been a relentless blue, began to curdle in the west, a bruised, ominous purple massing on the horizon. Cale's gaze was fixed on it, his body suddenly taut. He quickened his pace, urgency replacing his usual measured tread. He gestured towards a narrow canyon, its rock walls rising steeply on either side. The wind picked up, whipping sand into Ilara's face, stinging her eyes. The air grew heavy, charged with an electric tension. Dust devils danced in the distance, portents of the storm's fury. Cale found a shallow overhang, a slight indentation in the canyon wall, barely large enough for them both. He pushed her gently but firmly towards it. "Stay," he commanded, the single word low and resonant, the first he had spoken directly to her beyond a grunt or gesture. The storm broke with terrifying suddenness. The wind howled like a banshee, a furious, deafening roar that seemed to tear at the very fabric of the world. Sand and debris flew horizontally, obscuring everything beyond a few feet. The sky opened, not with rain, but with a blinding, suffocating deluge of dust. Cale stood at the mouth of their meager shelter, his body a shield against the worst of the onslaught, his back to her. He braced himself against the rock, an unyielding figure against the storm's rage. Ilara huddled deeper, terror gripping her, yet mingled with it was a strange sense of security in his presence. She watched his silhouette, the way his muscles tensed against the wind, his calm amidst the chaos. He was a part of this wildness, yet he was also her protector from it. Hours seemed to pass in the maelstrom. The world was reduced to the shriek of the wind and the stinging bite of sand. Then, as suddenly as it began, the wind started to abate. The dust began to settle, revealing a landscape transformed, scoured clean, yet somehow more desolate. Cale finally turned, his face caked with dust, his eyes narrowed against the lingering grit. He looked at Ilara, a quick, assessing glance. He coughed, a dry, rasping sound. She saw then that the storm had taken its toll on him too. Without thinking, she fumbled for the water skin, offering it to him. He hesitated for a moment, then took it, drinking sparingly. Their eyes met over the rim of the skin, a fleeting moment of shared experience, of having weathered something terrible together. The unspoken acknowledgement passed between them, they had survived. The immediate threat had passed, but it had forged a new layer in their developing bond, a reliance born not of words, but of shared peril and quiet solidarity. When the last vestiges of the sandstorm had dissipated, leaving the air tasting of grit and the light a strange, diffuse yellow, Cale surveyed the altered landscape. Familiar landmarks were obscured, new drifts of sand had reshaped the terrain. Their meager supplies were further diminished. He moved with a renewed sense of purpose, his gaze scanning the ground, searching. Ilara, understanding the unspoken urgency, found herself wanting to contribute, to be more than a burden. She watched him, trying to learn, to discern what he sought. He paused near a cluster of rocks, his attention caught by something she couldn't identify. He knelt, using his knife to carefully dig around the base of a desiccated-looking plant. After a few moments, he unearthed a series of pale, tuberous roots. He examined one, then nodded, seemingly satisfied. He gestured for her to help gather them. It was a small task, her fingers fumbling in the loose soil, but it felt significant. For the first time, she was actively participating in their survival, not merely being led or protected. As they worked, their hands sometimes brushed. There was no flinching now, no recoil from the contact. A quiet rhythm established itself between them, a partnership of necessity. Later, as he skillfully kindled another small fire in a more sheltered spot than the previous night, using the driest scraps of wood the storm had spared, Ilara found herself observing not just his actions, but the man himself. The lines etched around his eyes spoke of sun and wind, of long watches and a life lived with an intensity she could barely comprehend. There was a profound sadness in his stillness sometimes, a deep well of experience she could only guess at. He was not merely a savage, as the people of her world would carelessly label him. He was a man of immense dignity, of quiet strength, bound by codes and a connection to the earth that her own culture had long forgotten, or perhaps never known. As he roasted the roots, turning them carefully in the embers, he glanced at her. It was not the impassive stare of their first encounter, nor the watchful observation of the early days. There was something else in his gaze now, a flicker of acknowledgement, perhaps even a nascent respect. He offered her a cooked root, the rough skin blistered by the heat. She took it, the warmth seeping into her chilled fingers. The taste was earthy, slightly bitter, but it was sustenance, hard-won and shared. The silence that settled between them was comfortable now, a familiar presence. It was in these shared silences, in these small, mutual acts of survival, that a profound, unspoken understanding was being forged, a connection deeper than words, built on the bedrock of shared hardship and a slowly dawning mutual regard. The desert, which had almost claimed her, had also stripped her bare, forcing her to see beyond the superficial, to recognize the common humanity that bound her to this Apache warrior. Days blurred into a rhythm of walking, resting, and enduring. Ilara grew stronger, her body adapting to the harsh demands of the desert. The fear, though never entirely absent, no longer paralyzed her. One late afternoon, as they traversed a rocky pass, Cale suddenly froze, his hand going to the knife at his belt. He motioned her down, his eyes scanning the terrain ahead with fierce intensity. Ilara's heart leaped into her throat. Crouching behind a jumble of boulders, she peered cautiously in the direction of his gaze. In the distance, partly obscured by a heat haze, were 3 riders. Their attire, their slouching postures, the way they handled their horses, it was them. The bandits! A cold dread washed over Ilara, so potent it almost buckled her knees. They were heading vaguely in their direction, perhaps tracking, perhaps simply moving through the territory. Cale made a swift decision. He pointed to a narrow crevice in the rock face, barely visible, then to himself, then motioned further up the pass, indicating he would draw them away. The implication was clear, she was to hide, and he would confront them or lead them on a false trail. Terror warred with a desperate new instinct. She couldn't let him face them alone. He had saved her, protected her. Before she could articulate the protest, he pressed a hand briefly on her shoulder, a gesture of finality, and then he was gone, moving with silent, incredible speed over the rocks, disappearing from her sight. Panic seized her. But then, she remembered his calm, his competence. She remembered the violet flower. Scrambling into the crevice, she pressed herself against the cold stone, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She heard the distant sound of horses, then a shout. Her mind raced. She was no longer the helpless woman from the stagecoach. She had learned from Cale, learned to observe, to endure. Her eye scanned her cramped hiding place. A loose rock, about the size of her hand, lay nearby. It wasn't much, but it was something. The sounds grew closer. She could hear voices, coarse and brutal. Then, a different sound, a sharp cry, followed by the unmistakable twang of a bowstring, then another. A yelp of pain. Silence. Then, more shouts, confused, angry. Ilara held her breath, every nerve screaming. What was happening? Had Cale? More sounds of a scuffle, a horse neighing in alarm. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Then, a new silence, deeper, more definitive. She waited, her body rigid with tension. Finally, after what felt like an age, Cale's figure appeared at the mouth of the pass, moving slowly. He was alone. He walked towards her hiding place, his expression unreadable from a distance. As he drew closer, she saw a dark stain on his buckskin sleeve, and a fresh scratch along his cheekbone. He had faced them. He had protected her again. He looked at her, then nodded towards the path ahead, indicating it was clear. Ilara emerged from the crevice, her legs unsteady. The loose rock was still clutched in her hand. She had not used it, but she had been ready. And in that readiness, she felt a profound shift within herself. She was no longer merely a survivor. She was becoming a fighter, in her own quiet way. They walked on, leaving the sight of the unseen confrontation behind. Cale did not speak of what had happened, and Ilara did not ask. The blood on his sleeve and the grim set of his jaw were testament enough. The encounter had cast a shadow, a reminder of the brutality that existed beyond their fragile sanctuary of 2. Yet, it had also solidified something between them. He had risked himself for her, unequivocally. And she, in her own small way, had been prepared to act, to defend. As evening approached, they reached a small, hidden spring, a splash of impossible green in the Arca landscape. Water trickled from a fissure in the rock, collecting in a shallow basin. It felt like paradise. Cale knelt and drank, then gestured for Ilara to do the same. The water was cool and sweet, the taste of life renewed. He carefully cleaned the wound on his arm, his movements precise. Ilara watched him, a deep ache in her chest. He had been injured protecting her. She tore a strip from the hem of her already tattered petticoat, the cleanest part she could find. Hesitantly, she approached him and, without a word, offered the makeshift bandage. He looked at the strip of cloth, then at her face. For a long moment, he simply held her gaze. Then, he nodded slowly and allowed her to bind the wound. Her fingers trembled slightly as she tied the knot, the simple act feeling incredibly intimate. This was a different kind of closeness, born not just of shared hardship, but of a dawning, mutual care. They made camp by the spring, the small fire a comforting presence. The nearness of water eased some of the tension that had been their constant companion. Ilara found herself thinking not of escape back to her old life, but of the present moment, of the stark beauty of the desert night, the quiet strength of the man beside her. She realized how much she had changed. The terrified, helpless woman from the stagecoach was a distant memory. In her place was someone harder, leaner, more attuned to the rhythms of the wild, but also, paradoxically, more open, more capable of seeing beyond the narrow confines of her previous existence. The silence between them that night was filled with unspoken emotions. Gratitude, respect, a shared understanding that transcended language and culture. As she lay looking at the stars, she knew this journey had irrevocably altered the course of her life. Whatever happened next, wherever Cale might lead her, she was no longer the same. The desert had stripped away her illusions, but it had also revealed a strength she never knew she possessed, a strength forged in fire and silence, and mirrored in the eyes of an Apache warrior. The next day, Cale led her towards a series of low mesas that shimmered in the distance. There was a change in his demeanor, a subtle shift Ilara couldn't quite decipher. He was still watchful, still attuned to the environment, but there was a sense of purpose that seemed directed towards a specific destination. As they drew closer, she saw signs of habitation, faint plumes of smoke rising into the clear air, the distant, almost imperceptible outline of what might be dwellings nestled against the rock. Her heart beat faster. Was this his home? Was he taking her to his people? The thought brought a complex mix of emotions, apprehension, curiosity, and a strange reluctance for their solitary journey to end. They reached the outskirts of a small, temporary encampment. Wickiups, crafted from brush and hide, blended almost seamlessly with the landscape. A few figures moved among them, their movements unhurried. Cale stopped at the edge of the settlement, turning to face her. His expression was, as always, difficult to read, but his eyes held a depth of emotion she had rarely seen. He raised a hand, pointing eastward, towards a faint trail that wound away from the encampment, towards the hazy line where the desert met a less barren land. There, he said, his voice low. Trail. Leads to Trader's Post. 2 days' walk. Then he looked back at her, his gaze direct, unwavering. You will be safe. Safe. The word resonated. He had brought her through the furnace, shielded her from harm, and now, he was delivering her to the threshold of her own world. A profound sense of loss, sharp and unexpected, pierced through Ilara. This was it, then. The end of their journey. She looked at him, trying to imprint his face on her memory, the high cheekbones, the steady eyes, the quiet strength that had been her anchor. Words failed her. What could she possibly say to convey the depth of her gratitude, the transformation he had unknowingly wrought within her? Thank you, she managed, the word sounding small, inadequate. For everything. He simply nodded, a slight inclination of his head. He then unfastened the small, woven token he had shown her after her breakdown in the desert, the one with the faded berry eyes. He pressed it into her hand. His fingers closed briefly over hers, a fleeting touch, warm and firm. Then, he stepped back. There were no prolonged farewells, no promises of future meetings. Their connection had been forged in silence and action, and so it would end. He turned and walked towards the encampment, his figure receding, merging back into the landscape that had birthed him. Ilara stood watching until he disappeared among the wickiups. The small, woven token felt warm in her palm. She looked east, towards the trail, towards the life that awaited her. It was a different life now, one she would face with new eyes, with a strength she hadn't known she possessed. The desert, once her terror, now held a piece of her soul. And the silent warrior who had saved her would forever be a part of who she had become. With a deep breath, she turned towards the trader's post, her steps no longer hesitant, but firm, resilient. The sun was still high, but its light no longer felt merciless, it felt like a beacon, guiding her forward.